Hello, friends. We are going to talk about gender diversity this week. So, without further ado, let's get to it. There we are. So, we're not just looking at typically probably what you would think of when you think of the rights of LGBT students. We're also going to be looking at how do gender biases impact all students basically of any gender as well. So it's kind of like I know I've got the slides rainbow themed because it's not every day you get to use a rainbow theme on your slide, but it kind of does zoom out and go beyond that. So without further ado, let's get to it. So the first thing we're going to talk about is gender, sex, and the LGBTQIA plus community. So some terms to know whenever people are talking about the differences between these things. Gender kind of refers to what we have as a social construct around what's traditionally considered masculine and feminine. So when people talk about their gender identity, they're talking about what they feel they are in terms of gender. Whereas sex, on the other hand, refers to the biological classification of a person as male or female based on physical characteristics. Most of the time those match, sometimes they don't. The I in LGBTQIA is one I wanted to point attention to because I feel like it's one that a lot of people don't know about, and that's intersex. And that's a biological condition where a person actually has biological markers of both the male and female sex. So while pretty much everything on the LGBTQIA spectrum, for the most part, kind of refers to how you perceive yourself, in the case of intersex, that one actually is a biological marker. So it is possible to be born with reproductive parts from both systems or chromosomes that would leave yourself to, if you were to take a blood test to test as one sex whenever you might have the outward markers of another sex. So that is something that can exist. It's not super common in the population, but it is common enough that I want you to know that it is a thing. That way you're not moderately confused in case you ever encounter that. Generally speaking, when you're looking at the LGBTQIA umbrella, the LGB stands for your lesbian, gay, bisexual group that typically most people think of. T stands for transgender. The opposite of that would be cisgender. And even, of course, whenever you're working with transgender students, not all of them are going to neatly fit into a box of male or female. Some may identify as non-binary or as gender fluid. Q can depend on who you're talking to, what it stands for. It can either stand for queer or questioning. Queer used to be a derogatory term. Some people have reclaimed it. Other people prefer not to use it. So kind of know your audience and who you're working with before you just go around using that one. Obviously, if you use it as an insult, then it's going to come out as an insult no matter what. But if you're referring to the queer community, just make sure that, again, you're working with people that don't view that as a derogatory term. I on intersex, we've already hit that one on the last slide. This is the most simplified version of the A you're ever going to get. And I'm sorry, but it's just for brevity's sake. But the A stands for asexual. Generally speaking, that exists on a spectrum, but it's for people who don't necessarily experience sexual attraction. Aromantic would be for people who experience attraction, but maybe don't have romantic feelings. That kind of falls in that spectrum there. And then the plus sign stands for any other identities that don't neatly fit into one of those categories, of which there could be many. So looking at gender bias and gender stereotypes is key because that's going to be something that you encounter in your teaching. So gender bias often starts early and isn't always done intentionally. So if you think about it, for example, we often tell our girls to be a good girl. And what does that imply? And then often we'll say things like, oh, boys will be boys. And what does that imply? So a lot of times this is kind of programmed in us from a very, very early age, for better or for worse. Certain careers have traditionally held gender expectations. So for example, if you look at elementary teachers, they tend to predominantly be women, which isn't necessarily a good thing, right? Because young boys need role models too. Likewise, consider the number of male nurses you've had versus maybe female doctors, right? There are disparities that happen in these fields, or female cops, for example, or girl engineers, or boy CNAs, things like that, right? We have this tendency to kind of pigeonhole certain careers for certain genders. If you think of female construction workers, right? So whether we like it or not, these gender biases are kind of baked into how we understand the world around us. And those biases subconsciously affect us, whether we realize it or not. For example, and if you click on the hyperlink, you can read the study on your own. But one study found that "is my son gifted" was Google searched twice as frequently as "is my daughter gifted," meaning more people were likely to perceive their sons as being gifted than their daughters, which is also kind of problematic, right? So it's not that I'm saying most parents are explicitly gender biased against their kids, because I don't think that's the case at all. I think the issue is we're often subconsciously impacted, whether we really want to admit that or not. which is why it's important to check our biases, right? Because sometimes those things are happening subconsciously and we don't necessarily realize, oh, maybe I'm being a little, biased here, right? It's the same way that, because you don't tend to see a lot of mathematicians and scientists who are female, and they certainly do exist. Girls often don't necessarily perceive themselves as strong in STEM subjects as boys do. And those are the kind of things that as a teacher, you kind of have to actively work to dismantle, because you never know. The next person to cure cancer might be a girl sitting in your room, and the next rock star elementary teacher might be a boy sitting in your room. So really getting rid of those biases is kind of critical for us to help people reach their true potential, right? So these stereotypes limit both boys and girls, right? Girls are expected to be well-behaved, compliant, and polite, conform to feminized norms, etc. Where boys are more likely to be more expected to be tough, physical, athletic, and have that boys will be boys nonsense that often kind of permisses or makes permissible, if you will, misbehavior and violence, which we really don't want to keep seeing continue. Girls are more likely to believe that only boys can be really, really smart. Again, which is a problem, right? Whereas boys are more likely to believe that doing good in school is something for girls. Again, these limit both genders, right? Girls are often more discouraged from math, despite the fact that there's no evidence that girls are innately worse at math. Whereas boys are often more discouraged from reading and writing because that's perceived as more of a feminine thing, despite, again, no evidence that there is any sort of biological difference there, right? And like on the bottom, it says that girls are often exposed to same gender role models like elementary school teachers, most of whom are women, whereas boys are most exposed to same gender role models like scientists and mathematicians, which often leads again to this perception. Someone, if you don't see anyone that looks like you doing it, you kind of get this subconscious idea that you can't in your head. I'll never forget, I met a pre-K teacher one time and she is phenomenal. I wish I could, if we had in-person class, I would bring her in to talk to you all. And she is a Black woman. And she told me that one time she was talking to her son about what he wanted to be when he grew up. And he was still young at the time. He's in high school now. But anyway, her son was like, he was talking about how much he really liked helping people. And she's like, oh, maybe you should be a teacher. And he was like, well, I can't be a teacher. Teachers don't look like us. And that was the day that she dropped the job she was doing in business, went back to school and became a teacher so that other young Black kids could see, no, you can be a teacher, right? And the same thing happens whenever we have these gender limitations as well. So it's really important that you see people in these fields. Otherwise, you don't necessarily perceive it as something you can do, right? So we talk about gender bias and gender bias and modeled behavior. How parents model behavior often impacts how their children view the world. So, for example, women are more likely to pass on to their daughters body image issues because if a woman is concerned about looking fat, her daughter subliminally picks up on that. So no pressure, women, if you've got daughters, but that's something you got to think about, right? Likewise, sexism is often learned from observing how parents treat each other based on gender. If you have a man who is rather dismissive of the women in the household, a lot of times the children will grow up to be the same way. And this is because children don't have fully developed abstract thinking, right? So they kind of categorize things into very basic categories. And that's not their fault. Their ability to think abstractly doesn't develop usually until middle school age. And it's only starting to develop then. If you've ever worked with middle school kids, you will be aware that they take everything very literally. But if it's not corrected, these assumptions can follow into adulthood. Not all of it comes from their home environment, though. So, for example, a study done in the UK found that an astounding amount of sexual harassment that girls faced happened at school. Okay. So this study, and again, this is the UK. I know this isn't America, but I think you'll find that it's pretty common across the world. The study surveyed girls ages 7 to 21. And like I said, if you click on the link in the slides, it will take you to the original study if you would like to actually read it all for yourself. 75% of girls in the study age 13 or older reported having experienced sexual harassment. This number pretty much holds true in America as well. Over 50% felt they were judged more for their looks than their abilities, and 20% had been on a diet before they even hit puberty. And a lot of times sexual harassment is so prevalent because victims traditionally haven't been encouraged to speak up about their experiences. Now, while this really has changed in recent years with the hashtag Me Too movement and things like that, that's been a relatively recent change. In the past, you just didn't talk about it. And in some cases, there are still situations where A lot of people have found that perhaps you are still kind of punished for bringing it up in a way, not like legally punished, but in the sense of like a lot of times people victim blame or they don't believe you. Like if you've ever heard the, oh, well, what was she wearing when she was attacked argument, right? Shouldn't matter, but yet somehow people still ask that. So again, we're making progress, but there's still progress to be made. So what you're going to do is I need you to look at these two articles, okay? One addresses the incorrect assumption that boys can't be victims and girls can't be perpetrators of sexual violence, because that's another issue that often happens as well too, right? We assume that like people are less likely to take male victims of rape seriously because, oh, didn't he want it? No, and that's really a problem, right? So that's what the first article looks like. The second one looks at misconceptions that teenage boys have about sexual assault, because some boys don't realize that they actually have gone too far because they've never been taught otherwise, which again is concerning because these will be the children that you'll have in class for someday. So in your reflection journal, I want you to address what responsibility, if any, do schools have to address gendered violence? What are barriers to doing it well? Again, just a paragraph. You're telling me what you think. Lastly, we're going to look at legal rights of students because a huge part of the Illinois professional teaching standards are having you look at legal cases. You need to know what you're getting into. So a study done by the Pew Research Center found that 5% of young adults identify as transgender, gender fluid, non-binary, or basically something other than whatever their assigned sex at birth was. Despite the fact that it's a very small percentage, the rights of transgender students are a very prevalent topic of debate on the internet and in many states. Again, despite the fact that it is a very small minority of children. And the rights of transgender students are going to vary greatly based on what state you teach in. A lot of their rights are still very ambiguous and open to legal interpretation, which creates potential issues for schools. So what you are going to do is you are going to look at a few examples. And I just kind of got a few posted here. So Florida, for example, would allow a transgender student to use the bathroom of their preference, but the school has to notice the school would have to notify every single parent in both a written letter and a public online announcement. So if somebody wanted to use the bathroom that was a different gender than what they were assigned at birth, that's fine, but the school has to write a letter to every single parent and post it all over Facebook. Obviously, you can imagine that might impact whether a student takes advantage of that or not. In California, some schools can provide alternative bathrooms and locker rooms for students, but they can't force a student to use them, and they ultimately can't deny access. Illinois, last time I checked, at least, the IHSA requires schools to collect medical documentation, sports records, and any gender advantages in sports and submit them on a case-by-case basis. So it kind of depends on the sport and what it is. Like if you're transgender and competing in speech, no one cares. If you're transgender and supporting and competing in wrestling, that might be a different story. In 2019, the Illinois Human Rights Commission ruled in favor of giving transgender students equal use of restrooms. ISB's provided guidance for non-gender conforming students, but it isn't legally mandated. So again, it all greatly depends on where you're at. So which you are going, I'm sorry, let me get there first. So just like Brown versus Board of Education changed the landscape of segregation, court cases are basically a huge driver of school policy in any scenario, but also particularly with regards to LGBT students. And again, whether the cases favor the student or whether it favors society's expectations, I guess, if you will, varies greatly from state to state. So on this next slide, I have a variety list of cases. And what you're going to do is you are going to look at 3 of them. Some of them specifically involve schools. Others are general rulings that would ultimately trickle down and impact schools. So what you're going to do is you're going to select 3 off the next slide. Tell me what the case is about, when it's from, and how it impacts or would impact schools. So all of the lists are over here. You'll notice that probably Oberfell is the one that people most think of when they think of that was the one that gave LGBT people the rights to same-sex marriage. I don't have that one on here because most of you are going to school to teach kindergarten through 12th grade. And if your kindergartners through 12th graders are getting married, you've got bigger problems to face, like talking them out of getting married while they're still children. So I haven't put that one on here. These are more particularly ones that would impact students. I just didn't want you to think it was an oversight that it wasn't on there. It was deliberate. We're focusing on things that really impact schools more. So what you will do, I'm going to open the little tab over here, is you have access to this little worksheet right here. You don't have to fill out anything that's in blue. I'll put this over here like this. So you're going to tell me what the name of the case is. So you'll just copy paste that off the slide. Summarize it in 1 to 2 sentences. Basically, what's the what's the short version of it, if you will. Be sure to include when it was from, what groups of people does it impact, and how does it impact schools, or how might it impact schools for some of the ones that are newer situations. It's really straightforward and to the point, guys. It should not take you too long to do this at all. All righty, back over here. Last and not least, we're going to look at safety and security issues faced by students who are of the queer community. So your final reflection log for this week is going to have you look at some data, because if you haven't gathered by now, I'm a huge data nerd. And this is reported by Glenson. But whenever you click on this right here, it is going to take you to state snapshots, and it is going to give you information basically about how students in each state report feeling in terms of safety. Okay, so what you will do is you will click on a state. So perhaps I am interested in seeing how students feel in Mississippi. And if I click on that, it will take me to a report where I can look basically at school climate for students in Mississippi. For example, 99% of students in Mississippi have heard somebody say gay in a negative way, such as "that's so gay," which I didn't realize people still said after the year 2006, but here we are. Same with like homophobic remarks, gender expression, etc. And each one of these is obviously going to be very different based on which state you pick. So you're going to pick a state and you're going to tell me about it. Again, it's a data analysis. It's not that hard. It's actually markedly easier than the other data analysis we did with the Illinois School Report Card, because you are just telling me a little bit about the overview that you read, which prepares us as we head into Anchor Project number 2. Don't forget that this is due at the end of the week, that it says it is due in Moodle, which I'm actually pretty sure is next week. Double check the Moodle and make sure, though, because I don't have that tab open right now. Remember, a couple of weeks ago, we talked about making sure that you interviewed a teacher or somebody else in the community or a student. Make sure you summarize that interview in 1 to 2 pages to finish that up from last week. Part 3 is specific research-backed interventions. So basically, what can we do at the classroom level? What can we do at the district level? And of course, what can we do specifically for EL learners? That was more related to last week's unit. Part 4 is just a half a page of reflection. And if you have not yet looked at Anchor Project number 2 and the preview of that, I highly recommend doing so. That way you can get to work on that. There's my sources, including my nice Slides Carnival credit, because I get everything from there. If you've got questions, as always, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I am happy to answer any questions that I can. And I look forward to hearing from you and seeing your homework assignments. So see you soon.